So before we cut, I mentioned that I had received some questions. I won't be able to answer all of them, but I will try to go through as much material as I can. A bit of housekeeping. Please make sure that your mic is muted if you are not speaking. So one of the questions I received was to ask for an explanation about what the shut door of the institution is at the Sunday law. Specifically Daniel 11 verse 45. Verse 41, sorry. So if we think about how our understanding of this waymark has developed, we have developed various models to explain this waymark. One of the key verses that has been in the DNA of this movement from the beginning is Daniel 11 verse 41. It tells the story of this entity called the King of the North that is on a mission. It's on a conquest. Those last 6 verses of Daniel 11 tell the story of the rise into power of the King of the North. So for the King of the North to rule supremely, it has to conquer 3 things. We should all be familiar with the story of this 3-step process. The King of the South, the glorious land, and then the world. The story of the King of the South is a bit more complicated than we've given it credit for in the past. I'm not going to explain it, but I'm just going to say that the story of the King of the South happens in 2021. So the King of the South is defeated in 2021. And then the King of the North turns its eyes on the glorious land as its next obstacle. And that's what we are investigating when we talk about the Sunday law. Before it eventually rules supreme at the last waymark, the close of probation. So I've received some questions about this story about the close of probation and the lead up to the close of probation. But I want to leave those for now Because if we don't understand the story about the Sunday law correctly first, there's no way we can understand the close of probation. It's this relationship between progression and repeat and enlarge that we have to take into consideration. Elder Tess in the past would frame it as threading, where if you want to understand a waymark, it has to be understood in the context of a story. Where that story is thread from beginning to end. So while there may be a lot of interest in understanding this waymark, we need to be sure that this thread has been thread properly through this loop. The loop, the needle of the Sunday law. So our study or discussion today is going to revolve around understanding the Sunday law. We've been talking about this subject for more than 1.5 years now. And we could go on talking about it forever. But the reason the movement has taken so much pain and effort to explain it is because in the context of the great controversy, this is a major turning point. The questioner in the question on the screen framed it as a shut door on institutions at that waymark. So if we know there's a shut door there, we know that there's a change of dispensation there. Because as one door shuts on one institution, and closes the dispensation of something, dispensation A comes to an end, another dispensation opens. And we need to understand specifically what dispensation is opening if we're going to understand the close of probation. So to understand this waymark, the movement has developed various models as time has gone on. One of those models is the story of the rise of the King of the North. That we get from Daniel 11 verse 41. What we can do with that is take that symbol, the King of the North, into the glorious land. And we can do line upon line with other stories that are similar. So where in our thinking in this story about the kingdoms do we read about the king of the north going into the glorious land? And capturing something. And capturing something. What stories come to your mind? I'll give you one. If we go back to where this all begins, this captivity, this times of the Gentiles, we can go all the way back to where this story begins in Babylon. We know that in the book of Daniel, there are going to be various visions that are given that talk about the relationship between the kingdoms of this world and, we'll say, God's people and Israel. Israel was the kingdom that God had raised up to do a work. I'm going to try and weave in various elements of Revelation 17 into our discussion. So try to hold these concepts in the back of your mind as we go through these topics. When Israel is raised up as a people, a nation, specifically a kingdom, what was it raised up for? What was it raised up to do? If we think of when God calls Abraham, and the Israelite people developed from that, what were they called to do? Feel free to type in the chat if you have any thoughts. What comes to my mind is that if we're going to frame it in religious language, they were raised up to reveal the character of God. What we mean by reveal God's character is reveal how God's kingdom operates. Because in heaven, there was this argument between Lucifer and God about what this kingdom in the universe should look like. God has a specific character. So here's God. I'm just going to draw him as a cloud. And, and here's the throne of God. And God's character and the throne look the same. Because they're built on the same principles. And so Lucifer says, the kingdom should operate differently, I think. And that argument goes from heaven to earth. So from when Adam and Eve sinned, it takes years for God's character to be lost sight of, until God finds it necessary to raise up a people, a kingdom. To teach the world about the principles of their kingdom. So the principles of God's kingdom. I want us to see how we go from this being a story about God's character to really being a story about God's kingdom. The principles of that kingdom, what is right and what is wrong. So Israel is raised up. They go through their own process where they rebel, where they repent, and they rebel again. But it gets to a point where this kingdom needs to be protected. It's come to the point where it's no longer revealing God's principles. It's no longer doing the job of developing God's principles here on earth. And so what does God have to do? Raise up Nebuchadnezzar, Babylon. So Babylon comes, and that's the story of all those kingdoms that follow after. For this kingdom, God's kingdom, to get to the point where God needs it to be, it has to go into what we would call hiding. It needs to be protected from itself. And these nations, Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, Rome, they take over the mandate to serve. Israel's job was to serve who? Its citizens. All those people had rights. They had lives. And so this government that's created, Israel, its job was to serve those people. But it gets to a point where it no longer does that. So now that instrument needs to be passed on to another kingdom that's going to do that. So the reason why Babylon is raised up is to serve. Serve the people, which is a good thing. The story of its moral fall is a different story. I want us to see that because it becomes important when we want to understand Revelation 17. But going back to our story about the Sunday law, with that background, if we think about that captivity that happens, we can look at it from different perspectives. Years ago, Elder Parminder explained through the use of a cylinder that you can look at the same object from different perspectives. From one perspective, it may look like this long object. And from another, it may look like a circle. So the studies that we do need to bear in mind which perspective we're looking at it from. So I just told you the story of a good Babylon. I want us to look at it from the perspective of Daniel chapter 1. So if we were to go to Daniel chapter 1, verse 1, this is the first place where we get light on this captivity. The interaction between Babylon and the glorious land. So I'll paraphrase the verses. It says, in Jehoiakim's third year as king, Nebuchadnezzar comes to Jerusalem and sieges it. Jehoiakim is taken captive. So here's Jehoiakim, who is taken captive. And what does Nebuchadnezzar take with him when he takes Jehoiakim captive? He takes all those vessels in the temple. Why did he do this? Why did Nebuchadnezzar feel it necessary to take those vessels from the house of God? Because in ancient times, when kings went out to war, they weren't just fighting against the physical armies that they saw in front of them. They knew that they were representing something larger than themselves. Their gods. So here's Israel. Here's Babylon. And each of them have their own different gods. And so when Babylon goes to war, they want to make a point that their God is stronger than Israel's God. It was a power move. It was psychological warfare. So when Nebuchadnezzar takes all the symbols of Israel's God from their sanctuary, Nebuchadnezzar is saying that your ideology is dead. It did not save you. Your God couldn't help you. And so when he takes those vessels out of the house of God and puts them in his temple, he's showing Israel that this war that we've been engaged in has been ideological. It's between these gods that we serve, not really between us. So what I wanted to see from this story is that this siege, this war, this battle between Babylon and Israel was between two ideologies. The ideas that these kings had about their gods. So when we come down and overlay that with Daniel 11 verse 41, methodologically, what we're doing is line upon line, where we take one story about the king of the north going into the glorious land, which was Nebuchadnezzar in the past, and we're using that to compare and contrast with Daniel 11 verse 41, our present history. And we saw that this was about ideas, so we can expect that Daniel 11 verse 41 is about ideas. Before we move on, does that make sense? Okay. So, with that in mind, that the Sunday Law Waymark is about ideas, I want to take us to another story. Elder Tess in 2018 is going to explore the story in Acts 27 through the lens of institutions. So she's going to develop this story about Paul on a mission to Rome and his interaction with these two boats, these ships. I want to focus on the ship of Alexandria. And I'm not going to prove it, but it was explained that this ship represents two institutions. USA and Adventism. If you read Ellen White's commentary about this ship in the life of Paul, we find out that this ship was carrying wheat. It's meant to carry wheat all the way from Alexandria to its final destination. It's meant to protect that wheat. And then she goes on to explain that this is a good ship. So if we know it's a good ship, and we know it starts in 1798, through different steps, we can show that the USA that Elder Tess was talking about is that lamb that we read about in the book of Revelation. Or the sixth kingdom in chapter 17. Often our studies are focused on the USA aspect, but I want to focus on the story of Adventism. So this ship set sail in 1798. And it goes on this journey until what happens in 1863. Some winds come and blow it off course. And what can winds be a symbol of? Doctrine, which is beliefs, which is ideas. So in 1863, there's something that doctrinally takes place that throw this ship off course. Now, to get to its destination, this ship doesn't go through the route that it was meant to go on. But I want to point out that it's doctrine that does this. A specific worldview. Or can I say prophetic view? And what's the example or the face of that happens in 1863? What doctrinal thing happens in 1863 that's going to turn the ship off course? In the past, we framed it as the rejection of the 2520. The rejection of the 2520 is a study in and of itself. Because what is this thing, 2520, a symbol of?
Time.
So someone said time.
Gathering and scattering.
Okay, I've heard gathering and scattering. So to the person that said gathering and scattering, in the context of what?
In the context of God's people.
So yes, in the context of, but what about God's people?
Them being taken into captivity, leading to
Okay.
their final repentance, and finally God restoring them back again because they've repented to do
Okay.
what they were called to do.
So someone has said that this is a symbol of time and gathering and scattering. In the context of God's people and them being scattered because they didn't do what they were supposed to do. But where was it written or explained what they were supposed to do? When we take this symbol from Leviticus 26, it's framed in the context of a covenant that God is entering into with Israel. And that covenant, that agreement, that binding document that sets out the terms and conditions of the relationship between God and Israel is going to have specific ideas that runs throughout the covenant. So if you were to think of two companies that write a contract, that contract is going to set out various terms and conditions about their relationship as companies. And the terms and conditions are going to say some explicit things But those explicitly written articles are going to have an underlying ethos. But what I mean by ethos is an underlying way of looking at the relationship. So when Adventism rejects the 2520, we often focus on the time element, but what takes place unbeknownst to them is that Adventism loses its prophetic insight. To understand this relationship between God and Adventism. Remember, God's gone into covenant with Adventism in 1844. But when they reject the 2520, now they have no compass to understand prophecy in its right framework. So now this ship is off course. It doesn't have a compass that works anymore. And time goes on and various events happen, 2001, that are going to damage that ship. But the one we're interested in is the Sunday law. And what happens at that way, Mark, is that now this ship is shipwrecked. At first, that ship was taken off course, but now it's shipwrecked, meaning it cannot do its job function any longer because it's shipwrecked. So in this story that I've told about an idea being rejected in 1863, how should we understand the shipwreck at the Sunday law? How should we understand the shipwreck at the Sunday law? If everything is framed around a specific worldview or ideas that this ship has, then hopefully we can see that the shipwreck at the Sunday law is also ideological. So there's a particular way of looking at prophecy that Adventism has used that becomes unfit for purpose. So here's Adventism all along that comes all the way to the Sunday law. And now that particular way of looking at prophecy becomes unfit for purpose because it's shipwrecked. problem is that when we use the word shipwreck, it sounds very negative. But if you have any familiarity with the study of covenants, for instance, you would see that this ship had to come to shipwreck. Because that way of looking at the world became unfit for purpose as time went on. So if you were to think of 34 AD, and Elder Parminder has, and myself and other teachers have spent time talking about these overlapping kingdoms. We know that at the end of ancient Israel, there were these two kingdoms that were overlapping. So if we were to think of the time of the end, 4 BC, as when the Christian church starts being formed, Jesus is born and the disciples are going to get raised up to build this Christian church. Before that, the Israelite structure, the Israelite system, had been running along. If we were to use the language of Revelation 2, 3, etc., we could call this Laodicea and Ephesus. But that particular system that Laodicea was operating under, that sanctuary system, with all its sacrifices and feasts in the yearly calendar, we know that in 34 AD, that system had to come to an end. So this system was given a job function to teach the people something about God, to teach specific principles. But now that system or way of thinking becomes unfit for purpose. And now the Christian church takes over. Because Jesus spends enough time building up the institutions of that Christian church. And now Paul, with all those other disciples, can explain Jesus in a different way. So I've expressed the point that I'm trying to make in different ways. Is that when we talk about these institutions like Adventism, and we frame it as the close of probation of that institution. Just like how 34 AD was the close of probation of ancient Israel's system. What we're discussing is that probation has closed for a particular system. And that system has a particular way of understanding prophecy. How did ancient Israel understand prophecy? What were the tools that were given to all those Israelites in the sanctuary system to understand prophecy? The prophecy for them was that Jesus is coming. And so what were the things that were given to explain that advent?
It's okay. I think I think it was a sacrificial system in the sanctuary.
So someone has said that it was that sacrificial system. So all those lambs that were killed all pointed to something. All those feasts that they had in their calendar pointed to something. There were examples of how God's kingdom would operate. What I mean by that is that all of these things, whether it's the sacrifices or the feasts, were examples of underlying principles. So here's an example, the the lamb that was sacrificed. And what was the principle that they were meant to learn? In that daily sacrifice of lambs, the lamb that was killed, what was the thing that they were meant to learn from that example?
Remission of
I
sin.
think
Remission of sin.
Okay, so I'm going to rephrase what was said to me. So someone said that it was to teach about the remission of sin. And I want to add specifically in the context of Jesus. So it pointed from that lamb being killed to take away sin to Jesus's death that takes away sin. So that whole system that they used to understand prophecy, I'm using the word prophecy and God's kingdom interchangeably. that system came to its end. That's what we mean when we talk about probation. Because Israel was meant to use the time that this system was in place to learn something about God's kingdom. Through all these examples. Do Israel succeed or fail?
It succeeded.
Israel, not the system.
I think Israel did.
Sorry, can you say that again?
Maybe pardon the question. Did you say Israel or the system?
So I'm going to repeat my question. You have two things, Israel and the system. The system exists to teach Israel something. To teach Israel about God's kingdom. And it's going to do that through examples. Through types. So do Israel learn the lesson that the system was trying to teach it?
I think Israel did not learn the lesson from that system.
So someone has said that Israel fails. Israel was under probation, testing. So Israel fails, its probation comes to an end, and the time of this probation was predicated on this system. As Daniel was told that an allotted time was given for Israel to learn its lesson. Before sacrifices and oblations would cease. So, if we think of what comes after, a new system has to replace system A. That's going to teach whoever is in that relationship the same thing in a different way. So Israel, because they fail, are going to be replaced. And who are they replaced by? That institution, Israel, fails. And which institution are they replaced by?
The Christian.
Say
the
that
Christian
again, sorry.
institution. The Christian institution, like
So
Ephesus.
yes, so
The
someone has
Christian
said the
church.
Christian church. So now this Christian church are going to learn these principles directly. Those principles are going to be learnt directly. no longer through examples. So if we take that story of Israel and we come down to today, and we have Adventism on this side, who's on the other side, or what is on the other side? This movement.
Movement.
And this movement that replaces Adventism because Adventism fails. How is it going to operate? So we said that pre-34 AD, how God taught was through examples. So it was an example-based system. And that's how Adventism, that's the only way Adventism could understand prophecy. That's the only way we could understand prophecy, through examples. But probation comes to its end, and our ideas or our ideological view of prophecy has to change. Because a system replaces the previous one. Yes, I'll start to wrap up. So a new system has to replace system A. And this system is principles based. So the way we, as the movement, need to understand prophecy going forward is directly through principles, not examples anymore. That has wide-reaching consequences or implications. So the original question was, what is the shut door of the institution at the Sunday law?
Excuse me, Curtis. Back to
So
the. Excuse
someone's
me, Curtis.
asking a question. Yeah.
Yeah. Back to the Adventism. When you're comparing Adventism with the movement, you talked about example based.
So I'm just going to repeat what you're saying for the translator on the other end. So,
okay.
So someone has asked about this comparison between Adventism in this example-based system.
I know this is if you're using example-based, I was trying to give an example. Are we looking at like the books of Daniel and Revelation? Are you putting it as an example based with the pioneers, the Millerites, and when you come back to the movement system, you're going to put principles. Do they still apply to the movement as a principle?
Okay,
when you talk about examples, what things are we actually viewing in this particular time period? Because if I could remember clearly, Mary spoke so boldly about Daniel chapter 8, verse 14.
Okay, sorry, you said a lot. I need to be able to repeat it for the translator. So the questioner asked about what I mean specifically when I say examples and principles. And so the questioner took me back to the prophecies in Daniel and the pioneers. To see if how they interpreted is what I mean by examples. You can carry on, questioner.
Yeah, I think that's all for now.
So
Thank you.
when we look at the Bible, it tells a story of God's people through time. And it's going to tell that story using various imagery, like beasts and women. But each of those things teach something. What we would say are principles. So when Adventism is raised up with the Millerites and Ellen White, they are going to interpret the Bible in a particular way. It's the way that they have to interpret the Bible because of the system they're operating in. The problem is that they get stuck doing that. So one place where they get stuck, where Adventism gets stuck, for instance, for example, when we talk about these kingdoms in Revelation 17, and we talk about the woman, the Millerites and Ellen White correctly understood that that fifth dispensation had to do with the papacy. But then when John says that this fifth is going to be resurrected, when they interpret that, what do? They take this example and they transport it from thousands of years ago into today, into the future. And so the expectation is that the papacy is the beast at the end of the world. Or that woman is a church. Which is why we keep getting questions today about why this woman is a person and not a church. Because it's using a methodology that has ended. Where you take an example from a particular dispensation and you just transport that example into your application for today. where if we were to do it correctly, using principles, we would try to understand what was the principle of this woman in the fifth dispensation. And yes, and we would see that the woman at a principle level was an entity with bad ideas. And so we can take that principle and bring it to the end of the world. And we use that principle to see how it manifests today. And the fulfillment will look different than how it did in the past. That's just one example. Did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. So the questioner said it answered their question. So I appreciate that I spent the whole hour talking about one question. But I really wanted us to take away from our discussion that Adventism was supposed to learn something about God's kingdom under this system. This way of studying prophecy. Another example of this way of studying prophecy is if we were to think of the line of restoration that we've explored in the past. Where we talk about racism, Sunday, and sexism. And we tied those issues to a waymark. Which we call the Sunday law. If I were to ask you, are those examples or principles?
Examples.
So someone said examples. Each of these instances are examples. So by learning that way, there's something we can learn underneath that, which we would call principles. And what's the principle that we were meant to learn when we viewed the great controversy through these specific lenses?
Equality.
So someone said equality. I
Is
just
it
want to expand that and say equal rights under the law. in essence, that God's kingdom, the law, values every individual equally, their rights. So that's why when we look at the Sunday law, we don't see anything about sexism or Sunday or racism. Or should I say, I'm going to stick with this one. Because our understanding of the end of the world for the last 5 years has been framed around gender as the test. And so our expectation was that this waymark would be a law about gender. But I want us to see that the reason why we expected that was because the way we viewed prophecy was shaped by a particular system. That sought to teach us using examples. So I don't want to say that gender is not part of the test. But I want us to identify that there's a wider principle at play. So I will read a verse as we close. Because another question I received, which unfortunately I'm not going to have as much time as I would like to answer, was what's the role of the movement and the individuals in this Sunday law time period in regards to warning the world concerning the events of the Sunday law. So in connection with what we just discussed about ideas and principles, I want to go to Ephesians 6, verse 10 to 12. I want to go to Ephesians 6, the book of Ephesians, chapter 6, verse 12. So a bit of context. Paul is talking to the church, the Ephesians. He's written this long letter encouraging them. These Ephesians live in one of Rome's major cities. And in that city, there was a lot of pagan worship. It was what we would call the epicenter of the occult world, dark magic. It was the center of dark magic. And in Ephesus, there was a temple of one of their gods, Artemis. I think the name was Artemis. You might be more familiar with the other name, Diana, the Temple of Diana. So Paul is writing to them in this context that there's a lot of magic that's going on, a lot of fear from the dark magic. And so I'm going to read verse 12 in whole, if you have it with you. Paul says about the armor of God, put it on. Paul says, put on the armor of God so that you can be able to fight against the devil. But what he says next is the key point of our study today. For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. So the point he's making, I'm going to frame it in my own words, is that this war that's going on that you can't see is not against flesh and blood. It's not against the people that you can see. But it's against principles that institutions hold. So institutions are going to rise up that are going to have various principles and hello? Are you there?
Yes, we are there.
Sorry, my translator seems to have dropped.
Sure. The power in the laptop of the translator is gone off. I don't know whether she can use this one.
Okay, she can use that one. Let me just assign it quickly. I'm wrapping up.
Sure.
Okay, can you hear me now? Are you okay? So the point that I was making was that this war that's going on, Paul says, is about much more than the people that you see day to day. So when the questioner asks, what is the role of the movement in warning the world? Ellen White's gospel is going to be about individuals. About saving individuals by warning them. Evangelism. But as the system changes, we've started to recognize that this fight is not against flesh and blood. It's not about warning individuals. This fight is taking place in the cosmic world. Where all those aliens, all those other creatures that God has made in the universe are watching on to see the principles that two kingdoms hold. The seventh kingdom and this movement. These two kingdoms have institutions that at a basic level are principally based on equality or no equality. So to the questioner that framed their question around evangelism, our role as individuals is not evangelism if we want the great controversy to succeed. It's ensuring that, as Elder Parminder would frame it, that the institutions of this movement get built. And the only way they get built properly is through ideological debate amongst ourselves by teaching. So that we can come to a consensus about what the truth is. How to run this movement based on principles of equality. Because the people that are judging us, let me not say judging us, but determining whether this great controversy gets finished or not, are not looking about whether we're good behind closed doors or if we can bring millions of people into our movement. Because they know something that we were told in 2021. The personal is political. And what that means is that if you want people to be safe, personal, then ensure the political system that you've set up is principally good. A, a bad system with good people is useless. There's no way to create a kingdom that will save people if you have good people but a bad system. If you want people to be safe, focus on the system. Okay, so a very quick recap. The first question that I was asked is, what is the shut door of the institution at the Sunday law? My explanation revolved around ideas and principles. Because at this shut door, two things happen. There's a change of system as a change of dispensation occurs. And as that system changes, a particular worldview has to change. When I say worldview, I mean way of approaching prophecy. From this example-based use to a principle-based system. So when we talk about shipwreck, we're talking about Israel Adventism's failure to learn what System A was trying to teach us. But like ancient Israel, a stone is cut out that is going to understand those principles correctly and build its institutions in a way that can resolve the great controversy. This movement. Because it's understood equality under the law beyond the examples that were given to us. To wrap up that question, I went to another question, which was, what is the role of the movement and individuals in warning the world? There's more that we need to talk about in this question. But one place I took us to was Ephesians 6 verse 12. to try and demonstrate that Paul has told us that this great controversy is not against flesh and blood. This controversy is between institutions, and institutions house principles. I hope that everything that we've gone through today may have answered some of your questions. I'm sure you have more. I'm sure people have more questions than they came with. But as time goes on, I'm confident that those questions will get answered. I want to apologize for running over time. And that I didn't manage to answer all of the questions that were sent to me. Does anyone have any closing thoughts or questions on what we've spoken about today?
Okay, I just have a thought. Thank you so much for that class. It's very helpful. I appreciate. Okay, I was trying to consider the subject of individualism and then institution, and it's actually good that you dwelt more on the ideology that we had acquired from the previous institutions. So when we when we're in the Sunday way mark, one concept we really find ourselves juggling it very hard. It's the individual role at the Sunday law and heading to the COP way mark. And like from our Lendy White was viewing it, we could view it like
sorry, can everyone pause speaking? So there's a translator that we have. For the benefit of the translator, I will rephrase the question that the questioner says and I'll repeat it. If that's okay with you, Dickens. Okay? Okay. Sorry, Sandra, carry on. But please keep it short.
Okay. Okay, I was talking about the concept of individualism and institution. And I was like, this is one thing that we find it very hard to juggle it, because prior to that, we had this ideology that an individual will have a role to play. Like when you get to the Sunday law, you're going to have the loud cry, and then you bring in the public evangelism, where we think we're going to utter the message to the people of the world. Both can be as a corporate to individuals, but when you approach this way mark, we don't see anything like that happening. And then when it comes to also the spiritual salvation of how individuals are supposed to act, you find it very challenging. So when you are trying to bring this concept, there are a lot of thoughts that are coming in my mind, and I wanted to ask a question: Does it mean individuals have a role in the institution?
So the question that Sandra asked was, as we think about this tension between the individual and the corporate, what role do individuals play? If this war is between institutions?
And what will God do to the individuals if they don't go by what the institution states?
And the amendment to that question, the addition to that question, was, what will God do with the individuals if they don't live by the institution? The problem we have is that our whole thinking about the gospel has been framed around individuals. Whether it's Ellen White's explanation about taking the gospel to the world, or Ellen White's explanation about individual salvation. I'm not trying to diminish the fact that there's a personal relationship that we have with God as individuals. But our entire perspective of what's going on has been framed around this individual experience. And what we're starting to see as we approach prophecy, which we should have seen from the beginning, is that we have a job as priests. This movement as priests called the wise, that, that are, we are called the wise. And Daniel will call us teachers as well. That specific job function, as I said, has been made personal. Teach people how to be good people, so that these people can be saved. But I hope we can see clearer today that that's not what we were raised up to teach, or questions that we were raised up to answer. Our job isn't to talk about our salvation as people. If anything, we shouldn't care about it. But we care about it because we were made to care about it by Ellen White. If we didn't have that, what we would care most about was God, God's kingdom, and whether it succeeds, whether the great controversy is decided or not. We wouldn't care about whether we're saved or not. So Elder Parminder will use a story in the Old Testament to show how Moses didn't care about his life. All he cared about was whether God looked good or not. So my suggestion is that when we focus on institutions, it will sound strange and uncomfortable, If the great controversy is going to be won, we shouldn't care about whether we as individuals are saved or not. So while we spend time talking about the individuals, because it's natural for us to do that, my suggestion is, if this movement is going to succeed, all we should care about is the movement. I know I didn't answer your question directly, but my explanation, I hope, explains why I can't answer that question.
Thank you, Curtis. That was very grateful. I was just thinking, like, when you look at the military, how it operates, when they succeed, they don't mention an individual name who has maybe done so well, whether a general, a lieutenant. They will say the soldiers actually did this. Whether they're those ones who died in the battlefield, others who succeeded, the whole victory goes to the military. It's not to the individuals. Yeah, I'm very
So,
grateful for the answer you gave. Yeah.
so Sandra gave an example about the military. And when people sign up to the military, they're handing away their individuality. Because all those patriots don't care if their lives are lost or not. Those patriots care about whether their kingdom that's going to war wins. So I like that parable that Sandra gave. Thank you. Silas has their hand up. That'll be the last question.
Yeah, thank you so much for the lesson. Mine is a follow-up also on what Sandra asked. We find it a bit, if not as if it is confusing, because we still have the Bible, and when we look at the direct commands that the kingdom of God need actually to succeed, that's the truth. But for it to succeed, the individuals also have something to do, either to bring that kingdom, to promote the kingdom. And I will use exactly Matthew chapter 28, verse 19. And the other text that we may not mention now. So we see that the kingdom to succeed, it must be made also known by the world. And I think that's where the question of whether the movement has to make itself known to the world, whether we call it public evangelism or maybe any other means of making that to be known, is what now I think is bringing questions, because we understand that the Sunday mark is the period between the Sunday to the COP is where, if we can do anything for the kingdom of God to be known, so that people have to be made to know that this is the right institution which they should align themselves with.
So,
Otherwise, the seventh kingdom, we see the problem with it. But then we contrast it like the seventh kingdom and the movement. So how are we going to make the movement known that the world will also see, and they have to find where they can take refuge? I think
thank
that's
you.
what
Yeah.
it becomes
So,
complicated.
yes, I am going to try and summarize it for the translator.
Yes.
So Silas's question is off the back of what was just discussed with Sandra. He asked, how is this movement meant to succeed if everyone else in the world doesn't know about it? So all those people, they need to find refuge somewhere. So how are they meant to find refuge if they don't know about it? So this comes down to what we think success is based on. So either success is based on drawing people in, so enough people know about the movement, or success is based on something that nobody sees. None of us here on earth see, at least. So we need to answer that question for ourselves. I can't make you see things the way I see them. Because we could exchange Bible verses all day, where one person reads them one way and another person reads them another. So I don't think that's beneficial. What I think is useful for us is to go to the core of what this story is about. And if we were to frame it, it's really between God and Satan that are going to use proxies here on earth I can say the seventh kingdom and this movement. And as I said in our study, Ellen White is going to go to Matthew and show that Paul took the gospel to the world. To show all these individuals about God. But I'm suggesting that instead of showing individuals about God, these two kingdoms on earth are trying to make a point to the universe we can't see. Behind closed doors. All those angels and other created beings are the ones that are going to determine whether this throne goes to God or goes to Satan. At a simple level. Based on whether a kingdom manages to adopt the principles of God or the principles of Satan. I've kept my answers superficial for now. I've kept my answer on the surface for now. Because as time goes on, and we start exploring the dispensation after the close of probation and etc., hopefully then we'll see in a bit more detail why and how this great controversy is won based on institutions. Without ever having to touch individuals. Because what we're fighting for is eternity. Not refuge for a few years here on earth. So whether we call 5 or 5,000 people into this movement, only applies a band-aid to their lives, to their problems. Only applies a bandage to their problems for a short term. But what we're trying to do is ensure that for eternity, there's a solution to their problems. Okay? I'll end there for now because it is way over time. And so I will end with a word of prayer. Join me as we pray. Dear God, thank you that we're able to speak openly, first of all. That we're able to discuss these ideas publicly. And I'm pretty sure that each of us have a lot of questions about the great controversy. I do. But I thank you that the institutions that have been built up until this point have been set up in a way that gives us the ability to explore those questions. Pray that you may be with us through the rest of the Sabbath. In Jesus' name I pray, amen.